Thank you for joining us for this lecture series on lessons not learned from the Holocaust. There are hundreds of you here. I'm sorry we're not in person, but we are in community. As always, I'd like to start by affirming that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. My name is Mika Ahuvia, and I'm the Marcia and Jay Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies here at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. As Curriculum Chair for Jewish Studies, I'm facilitating this series of lectures, which is also a 2-credit course here at the UW. Today's speaker is Professor Devin Naar, the Isaac Elhadaf Professor in Sephardic Studies, Associate Professor of History, and faculty at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies. His first book, Jewish Salonika, Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, was published by Stanford University Press in 2016. The book won a 2016 National Jewish Book Award and the 2017 prize from the Modern Greek Studies Association. His second book project explores Sephardic Jews' encounter with the U.S. immigration system and America's racial hierarchies, including in Seattle. He's currently a fellow at the UW Simpson Center for the Humanities, working on the book. As the chair of the Sephardic Studies program, Dr. Naar and his team have created a vast digital repository of archives and books pertaining to the Sephardic experience. The program also develops innovative digital exhibitions on their website and hosts public events in collaboration with the Stroum Center, including the upcoming virtual Ladino Day on December 6th, revolutionizing Ladino from the printing press to the smartphone.
I wanted to begin by telling you a story. And among Sephardic Jews, there's a genre of story known as the conseja. These are told to entertain, to educate, and sometimes to share a lesson. They tend to be anonymous, but I'd like to tell you a personal one. As a college student, I attended a community-wide Holocaust commemoration. And before the program began, I was chatting with some of the other attendees. An elderly woman inquired what my connection was to the commemoration. And I explained that my grandfather's oldest brother, Salomon, who you can see pictured here with his wife, Esther, along with their 2 children, Benjamin and Rachel, were murdered at Auschwitz. The woman asked, well, where were they from? And I said, Salonika, in Greece. And she processed what I said for a minute, and she replied, that can't be. I was a prisoner in Auschwitz, and I never met a Jew from Greece. Confronting this kind of Holocaust denial, I mean, that's how I felt it. That's how I experienced it. This sense that my family's experience was not true, that the Jews of Greece did not experience the Holocaust was really shocking, even if it may have been unintentional on the part of my interlocutor. The response from the survivor revealed that she had never encountered, that she had never had to think about or deal with the full scope of the Holocaust in terms of its geography, in terms of its cultural impact, to think not only was Yiddish decimated during the Holocaust, but so too was Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language of the Sephardic Jews. Now, the city that my family came from, Salonika, was once home to the largest of the Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jewish communities in the world a century ago. These were Jews who were descendants of those who were expelled from Spain in 1492 and scattered across the globe, with many of them traversing the Mediterranean and settling in what was then the vast realm of the Ottoman Empire, where they developed their own culture and community and institutions in the context of the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire for more than 4 centuries. Now, these Sephardic Jews settled in many different cities throughout the region, but what made Salonika particularly distinctive was that Jews constituted more than half of the population 100 years ago. They participated in all aspects of the society, from the working classes to the middle classes and even some very prosperous people in the city. The imprint that they made on the city was so profound that the entire port closed on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, in observance of Jewish practices. It became known as the Shabbatopolis, the city of the Sabbath. But the years surrounding World War I were incredibly tumultuous. They were violent and resulted in many displaced people, in mass violence, and devastating consequences. More than a decade of war engrossed this entire region. Just across the Aegean Sea from Salonika in Anatolia, the Young Turks perpetrated the Armenian genocide, which resulted in the murder of more than 1 million Armenians, many of whom were deported by railroads built by Germans to the deserts of Ottoman Syria. They were killed there or died of starvation. Some survivors who evaded death even found their way to Salonika. Meanwhile, in that city, Salonika and its Jewish population came under the new rule of the expanding Greek state. Like other countries in that era, Greece imposed a series of measures to try to consolidate the new idea of the nation state. This idea that each people constituted a discrete nation with a shared history and language and religion, a shared future, and they should all be bound within the framework of a single state. This idea of the nation state took a hold of communities across the region and beyond. They used force and they used violence and they used political means to transform the demographic makeup of the region. So in the name of consolidating further the nation states of Greece and the new nation state of Turkey, those two countries decided to mutually expel populations. So 1.5 million Orthodox Christians were kicked out of Turkey and sent to Greece, and 500,000 Muslims were sent out of Greece and forced into Turkey. Meanwhile, Jews themselves, having no state of their own, having no state to claim or protect them, remained where they were. The Greek state directed 100,000 of these Orthodox Christian refugees from Turkey to the city of Salonika itself in order to try to transform the demographic makeup of the city once and for all, and transform what had been an Ottoman and Jewish city into a Greek city once and for all. It's within this framework that my family, pictured here, this is my grandfather, my nono, these are my great-grandparents. In the wake of this transformation, in the wake of the end of the city resting on the Sabbath, my family wound up leaving and coming to the United States with my great uncle, who I pictured before, who had been in the United States already, came back and then could not get a visa to return. He remained. The rest of my family came to the States at this time, thanks to them forging some of their birth dates on their official documents and taking advantage of a loophole that enabled people who were clergy, religious figures, to be exempt from the very strict quota restrictions that had been placed on immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. My family came in just within this context. By the time that the Second World War came around, the conflict initially seemed distant in another part of the world, another part of the continent. But soon, by 1940, the alliance between Mussolini and Hitler resulted in the invasion of Greece. And eventually, the country was divided into 3 zones of occupation that you see here. Germany took control of that center red part in the north central part of Greece because that's where the bulk of the country's Jews lived, in Salonika. But all those other dots there, many of those represent places where there were other Jewish communities, more than 20 Jewish communities in Greece at this time. There, within the context of the German occupation of Greece, some of the local Greek Christian populations took advantage of these new circumstances, the oppression of the occupation, to further implement a long-standing desire that they had with regard to the continued Hellenization, the nationalization of this city and its conversion from an Ottoman and Jewish city into a Greek city. And that transpired over the fate of the Jewish burial ground in Salonika. It was the largest Jewish burial ground, one of the largest Jewish burial grounds in the entire world. 350,000 graves that stood on a terrain over 80 acres, a massive Jewish burial ground. And the university of the city was overlooking the edge of the cemetery. So under the cover of the German occupation, the local Greek Christian population, the leaders of the university, the city hall orchestrated the complete destruction of the Jewish necropolis of Salonika. Marble tombstones were used to pave streets and to line latrines, to fabricate and literally build the rest of the campus of the University of Salonika, which sits today exactly on what was once the expanse of that vast Jewish cemetery. It is now the largest university in all of Southeastern Europe, the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, built on top of what was once one of the world's largest Jewish grave sites. And the fate of the dead anticipated in some ways the destruction of the living. In the spring and summer of 1943, a fifth of the entire population of the city of Thessaloniki was ripped from their homes, ghettoized, and deported 7 days by train to their fate in Auschwitz. 50,000 Jews nearly were deported, and only 2,000 survived, so making Salonika one of the communities with the highest, most devastating mortality rates, and Greece in general had one of the most devastating mortality rates of any Jewish community, second only to Poland. The Jewish metropolis of Salonika, the Jerusalem of the Balkans, was essentially no more, although those survivors that made it back to the city did begin to rebuild their life anew. But it was a completely different universe. Instead of being 50% of the population, now they were 1,000 people in a much larger city. Today, they are 1,000 people in a city of 1 million. Their Jewish cemetery destroyed, 60 synagogues reduced to 2. Not only that, they were essentially erased from the collective memory, from the cityscape of Thessaloniki, and from the Greek national memory. And they have largely been omitted from the narratives that we tell about the Holocaust today in the United States. How do we explain this kind of absence? How do we explain the kind of encounter that I had as an undergraduate student at that Holocaust commemoration so many years ago? That kind of perhaps inadvertent denialism. Indeed, in academic circles, in popular imagination, in public commemorations, Sephardic Jews, those from beyond the conventional boundaries of the West, beyond the core of Europe, they tend to be relegated to the margins of the story of the Holocaust, or they're written out altogether. Why? Why has the Holocaust been conceptualized as a European event? What is lost when we insist on the European essence of the Holocaust? Check out this map, by the way. Salonika is mentioned, but the rest of Greece is already cut off here. It's interesting. We'll talk more about that in a moment. At a conference a couple of years ago about future directions in Holocaust studies, one of the major speakers there, a very important scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., observed that by intent, design, and implementation, the Holocaust was a European event. And the scholar highlighted how the research conducted in the field in the last few years has been preoccupied, in fact, with Europeanizing the Holocaust, with reconceptualizing it not only as a German-centered event as it historically had been, but rather as a much broader continent-wide phenomenon. The expanding boundaries of the event offer unprecedented new perspectives and opportunities to think about the scope of the Holocaust. But my fear is that the persistence of, indeed the insistence on a European framework, might actually hinder our ability to to fully grasp the extent of the catastrophe, and it might also perpetuate, however unintentionally, by an insidious manner, the very kind of eurocentrism that animated the Nazis themselves. Is there really room in a European narrative to grasp the experiences of the tens of thousands of Jews born in the predominantly Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire who perished in Auschwitz? We must go further. The reality is that we should consider the Holocaust not only a European event, but an event that stretched into European colonial contexts. We should consider it as a global event with worldwide ramifications. It was not only Nazi Germany that established an empire across Europe, but that imperial conquest took place in a much broader framework of European colonial expansion. The difference was those other empires occupied, subjugated, and perpetrated violence outside the boundaries of Europe. And it's by reference to that imperial framework that we may begin to expand our understanding of the Holocaust and gather a better sense of its meaning. So, by reference to this empire, we can begin to tell the story of the Jews of Rhodes, for example, which, by the way, Rhodes would be like way down here. From the island of Rhodes, you can actually see the coast of Turkey. The island of Rhodes had once been part of the Ottoman Empire for many generations, for many centuries. It was occupied by the Italians just before World War I, and it was conquered by the Germans. And, in the summer of 1944, toward the very end of the war, the German deportation apparatus arrives on that island and dedicates manpower and resources to rounding up merely 1,700 Jews on this faraway island, taking them by ship to the port of Athens and deporting them up through Europe, up through the Balkans, into the heartland of Europe, to Poland on the railroad tracks. This is a voyage that took 23 days. So much energy. The end of the war. It demonstrates, in fact, how invested the Nazis were in executing the final solution. More important, a greater priority than even seeking to win the war. So if we can include Rhodes, and there's a good reason for us to do that, especially here in Seattle, given the fact that Seattle is home to a very relatively large community of the descendants of Jews from Rhodes, and there's even a replica at one of the Sephardic congregations here in Seattle of the Rhodes monument on that island, a sign of connection between our city and that island. But beyond Rhodes, what happens to a place like Turkey? Can Turkey be part of a story of the Holocaust as a European event? Turkey emerged as an independent republic in the wake of World War I after it liberated Istanbul and parts of Anatolia from those same European colonial forces, the French, especially the British. And they also had to forsake their territories in the Middle East, which were conquered by those same European colonial forces. And it was then in the name of that same ideal of the nation state that Turkey began the process of nationalizing, stripping away, continuing some of the processes that had begun with the Armenian genocide, with the expulsion of the Christians from the country, beginning to target Jews in a number of different ways, forcible assimilation, and then during World War II, and in the lead up to World War II, stripping Turkish Jews who were living abroad in Europe of their citizenship. Even when they were given the opportunity to accept Turkish Jews back into the country by the Nazis in other parts of Europe, Turkish Jews living in Paris or in Berlin or Brussels, the Turkish Foreign Ministry said, no, we don't want them. And thousands of Turkish Jews wound up in the concentration camps. Those who were in Turkey itself, as non-Muslims, became subject to very severe capital tax in 1942, and those who couldn't pay wound up in forced labor camps. And indeed, the Nazis had included Turkey as part of its final solution. They listed Turkey and its 55,000 Jews as part of the Wannsee Protocols in 1942. If we expand this idea of the boundaries of European empire even further, we can enter into other terrain as well. The really even more invisible, yet no less significant experiences of Jews in North Africa. Again, the Nazis counted several 100,000 Jews from North Africa as part of what they anticipated as the final solution to the Jewish question. We're talking about Algeria, we're talking about Tunisia, we're talking about especially French Morocco, Italian occupied Libya. Jews in these locales were subjected to various anti-Jewish measures. They were conscripted into forced labor, as we see in Tunis, a remarkable photograph. Many were sent to camps, and thousands died. These were Arabic-speaking Jews, some of whom spoke French or other languages. They lived side by side with their Muslim neighbors for generations. And we encounter essentially nothing about them in the mainstream narratives of the Holocaust. The thousands of books about the Holocaust that have been written, the first one to be written about the Jews of North Africa and the Holocaust came out in 2018. And here's a map from that book. Look at all of these penal labor and internment camps all throughout North Africa. It's really remarkable. Is it because it's outside of Europe, so it doesn't matter as much? They are living and inhabiting in a Muslim kind of world. What do we have to say about that? I wonder perhaps if there's even some latent Islamophobia in the way that we think about the Holocaust and discuss it even today. Perhaps you're familiar with the figure of the Musulman. These were those prisoners in the camps who were unwilling or unable to adapt to conditions there. They sunk into apathy and dejection. Now, the etymology of Musulman is unclear, but the term is very, very close to the German word for Muslim, which is Musulman. The spelling is a little bit different, but the pronunciation is essentially the same. And scholars suggest that this is no coincidence, that the alleged resemblance of these prisoners, unable to stand on their feet, appear as if they are Muslims prostrated in prayer. As Primo Levi famously wrote, the Musulman are the living dead, the tottering corpses. They cannot understand. They have submitted. They are, as imagined in the racist European mind, like Muslims. Why then do we continue to speak about the Holocaust as a European event? The issue is not only one about numbers of victims, the vast majority of whom were in Europe, in Eastern Europe, but it's also conceptual, methodological, political, ideological. Our map, our world remains Eurocentric. When we speak about the real Europe, we really mean places like France and Germany. We have to talk about Eastern Europe when we want to refer to Eastern Europe. And Greece, well, we have yet another term to refer to that region. It's called the Balkans or Southeastern Europe. Its proximity to the Mediterranean, to the Middle East, to the lands of Islam, somewhere between historically civilization and non-civilization, have rendered it less European, less Western, less part of the center of the narrative. But in some ways, the Holocaust made all of Jews living in the geography of Europe, European Jews for the very first time. Now, if you look at the term European Jews or European Jewry, you will find that it's a relatively new category. And here you can check out, I don't know if you're familiar with Ngram. It's a marvelous tool where you can type in any term you want and see how often it appears in all of the millions of books that have been digitized and are searchable on Google Books. And it gives you a sense of how terms develop and their frequency of use. And you can see here that the idea of European Jews literally emerges in the middle of the war. It doesn't even exist as a category. These words put together do not exist. It's their shared victimhood that Jews across the continent become European Jews. They become European Jews in a way in which Europe seeks to come to terms with the tragedy, the violence that they have perpetrated. It made Jews part of Europe. They may have belonged, in a certain sense, to different European countries before. It was precarious as French Jews, German Jews, Russian Jews, but the idea of the European Jew literally did not exist before the Nazis. In fact, prior to the Nazis, few would have even considered Jews really European at all. The most common notion was that Jews did not belong on the continent. They were foreigners, they were interlopers, they were perpetual others. The fact that Jews were shedding their status as a distinct group and gaining opportunities and rights and assimilating into broader society, that's precisely what the Nazi regime was seeking to undo. When Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, referred to Jews as a mongrel breed, as an Asiatic race that had no rightful place in white Christian Aryan European civilization, he was only adding a new and really more sinister gloss to an older idea. The alleged non-European nature of the Jews was the argument of the very first self-proclaimed anti-Semites. And here you can get a sense that this term anti-Semitism, you can get a sense, capital, lowercase, with a hyphen, without a hyphen, does not exist till the very end of the 19th century. It's first coined in German, the end of the 1870s, beginning of the 1880s, by a figure named Wilhelm Marr, who was a German race scientist and eugenicist. And in the language of the day, according to the scientific experts, the linguists and the anthropologists, Jews were beginning to be classified as Semites according to their racial identity. Semites because it was understood that their ancestral language was Hebrew, and Hebrew is like Arabic, a Semitic language that has its origins not in Europe, beyond the boundaries of Europe, in the so-called Orient, in Palestine, in the land of Israel. But Goebbels repackaged these earlier ideas of anti-Semitism that were developed by figures like Marr, but both of them drew on earlier conceptions. You know, we can go back to the heart of the European Enlightenment. We can go through Nietzsche, and we can go all the way back to Immanuel Kant. And he was in some ways one of the first racial, indeed we might say racist thinkers of the modern era. In Kant's theologically infused view of the world and its racial hierarchy, he believed that only white men, and its men, were capable of realizing their full potential as rational, autonomous humans, with their ability to actualize the true spirit of Christianity, which he saw as the bedrock of Western civilization. At the bottom of that racial hierarchy, he positioned Black Africans, whom he viewed as a race, and he considered them in the most horrifically stereotypical terms as lazy, indolent, dawdling. Now, Jews, even European Jews, fell somewhere in between. Kant once referred to Jews in his environment as Palestinians in our midst, revealing how he viewed them as part not of Europe, but of Palestine, of the Middle East, of the Orient. The fact that Jews were in his midst meant that they posed a greater, even more immediate threat than Black people, who were largely at the time in Africa rather than in Europe itself. The status of Jews as aliens within Europe allegedly threatened to impede the realization of the white man's full human potential. And as a solution, Kant proposed what he called the euthanasia of Judaism, to erase through re-education, with re-education and with the correct culture, and make Judaism go away for the benefit of Jews themselves. Now, it may be tempting to draw a line from the European Enlightenment to the train tracks of Auschwitz. So, in a dark and devastating irony, it is only with the mass murder of the Nazis and a century and a half after Kant, that Jews across the European continent come to be conceptualized as European Jews. It is through their destruction that they become codified as part of the story of Europe, when no one had thought of them as such before. Not only that, the Holocaust was the event that changed how Europeans thought about mass violence. Mass violence, of course, was not new. New technologies, there was new levels of systematic and bureaucratized murder, highly developed ideologies. Anti-Semitism is sort of a kind of a theology of redemption. that was distinctive, and a new word was actually created at this time to capture it: genocide, the murder of a genos, of a people, of a nation. And you can see here genocide, again, coined in the 1940s. Holocaust comes even much later, and Shoah entering the English. But mass violence, of course, is much older. Colonial violence is as old as colonialism itself, going back to the 15th century and the conquest of the Americas. The extension of European colonial rule over much of Africa and the Middle East and beyond in the 19th and 20th centuries was predicated on mass violence. Indeed, the 20th century's first genocide was perpetrated at the beginning of the 20th century by German colonial forces against 100,000 Herero people in German Namibia in Southwest Africa. And we already spoke about the Armenian genocide, which came during the First World War. But what made colonial violence, including the Herero genocide, even the Armenian genocide, somehow less objectionable from the perspective of the European powers was that these were acts that were perpetrated by so-called civilized Europeans against non-European, uncivilized, or lesser civilized people in the case of colonial violence in the Herero, or violence perpetrated between non-European peoples in the case of the Armenian genocide. What made the Holocaust stand out, what made it change things, was that it was mass violence perpetrated by Europeans, principally against others who were now considered also Europeans. This was the kind of violence that the great powers in the wake of the Holocaust argued had to come to an end. And we even have a new term that we'll develop to think about the ways in which Jews will now become part of the experience of Europe. And that comes in the context, especially of the development of the Cold War. And we see the invention of yet another new idea, the idea of the Judeo-Christian values, Judeo-Christian civilization. This is a term we have now. We probably in some ways take it for granted. Look again, engram, it does not exist before the rise of the Nazis. No one thought that Jewish and Christian values were aligned before then. But in the wake of the Second World War, with a sense of regret, despair over the devastation of the genocide of the Jews, and perhaps just as importantly, with a new enemy on the rise, namely the Soviet Union and its atheism and communism, the category of Judeo-Christian emerged as a weapon to unite the West, real Europe, with the new threat of communism on the one hand, and also in some ways Islam on the other. So now we come to our conclusion. What are the lessons not learned from the Holocaust? And one of the most revealing ways to approach this question is to look at the founding of the United Nations after World War II. A new international governing body, the successor of the League of Nations. Now, the UN sought to ensure peace across Europe and beyond, but especially within Europe. So what did the UN learn? Essentially, the UN learned that the Nazis were correct in their belief that ethnic homogeneity should be the ideal framework for the organization of countries and societies across the world, and that action should be taken to achieve that unification. Okay. The problem with Nazi rule, however, was several-fold. First, the Nazis sought to implement their goals through violence and without the support and consent of the great powers. The model should have been along the lines of Greece and Turkey, the exchange of populations that they did, the mutually agreed upon expulsions that was done and sanctioned under the auspices of the League of Nations. And thus, that's exactly the model that the United Nations had in mind in the wake of the Second World War, when millions of Germans in Eastern Europe were uprooted and returned home to Germany, when millions of Ukrainians, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, and Albanians were also uprooted and moved around. This was the principle that was applied to Pakistan and India. This is the principle that was applied in the Balkans in the 1990s, and it's the principle that has been considered with regard to trying to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict for the last 80 years. Secondly, the general consensus was that the problem with Nazi empire was not that it was an empire, no problem with empire at the time, or that it was an empire built on racism or animated by mass violence. The French and the British retained major overseas colonial holdings. In the United States, too, we still have colonial holdings in some ways. Think about Puerto Rico. But the problem was that the Nazis built the wrong kind of empire, founded on the wrong kind of racism, with violence directed at the wrong target. This becomes most clear when we take a closer look at the main architect of the Charter of the United Nations, especially the preamble. You should definitely read it if you haven't already. And when you read the preamble of the United Nations, please keep in mind that the chief architect of the preamble of the United Nations, which sets out what the mission of this organization is, the chief author of this document was none other than the same man who is the main architect of apartheid in South Africa, Jan Smuts. And here it gets really dark. For Jan Smuts and for other European leaders like him, the problem of World War II, the problem of the Holocaust, was that the Europeans had fought against other Europeans. They had murdered other Europeans. They had dispossessed other Europeans. They feared that such intra-race war would have dire consequences on their colonial possessions, and the power of Europe and the white world could be in jeopardy if there was this internal kind of strife. It would take away efforts to continue to subjugate people beyond Europe. And Smuts saw the same conflict in South Africa in itself. He saw that the British and the Afrikaners they needed to unite in order to maintain their power over Black Africans. So the purpose from Smuts's perspective and those who supported him was to create a United Nations with the main European powers and, most importantly, the new great white superpower, as he saw it, the United States. To ensure a unified front, not principally against communism or not only against communism, but against the allegedly backwards and uncivilized races of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. To colonize those lands with Europeans, to make sure that natives are only permitted to participate in world politics, if at all, only once they have been sufficiently civilized, dispossessed of their backwards culture, re-educated according to the allegedly universal values of humanity, that is, the very specific particular values advocated by the self-proclaimed civilized world, values like liberalism and democracy. It would be for their own good. From Smuts's perspective, human races deserved recognition and rights incrementally, based on their level of civilization. So whether someone was fully part of the human family and deserving of human rights was contingent on the extent to which they were perceived as civilized, as acting according to the principles of Europeans. Even if they could never look like them, they could never become white, but perhaps they could act, they could think like them, they could organize their societies like them. So this is why South Africa could support human rights in Europe and apartheid in South Africa. This is why the United States could support human rights and segregation at home. This is how Switzerland could exclude women from the right to vote until 1971, while also signing on to endorse human rights. These practices and the contradictions embedded in them were really contingent upon the very specific definitions of who counts as fully human and who does not. And that's the world we still live in. We live in a version of this United Nations world. We live in a world divided into different worlds. We have the West and the rest. We have the first world and the third world, or the so-called developing world, or the global South. These are different terms that relate to each other, and they represent different iterations of dynamic and disparate power dynamics. Have no illusions. We have by no means done away with civilizational or racial hierarchies. They may look a little bit different now, but they still exist. These hierarchies are ubiquitous. We cannot even see them. And that actually gives them so much power. They are so entrenched. They're so obvious. We just speak with so many assumptions built into our language that replicate these ways of thinking about power and hierarchy. Who is truly human? Who is at the center of the story? Who is at the center of the human drama? And these prejudices, these injustices have also seeped into the ways that we speak about the Holocaust even today. And this brings us back to the beginning. And I believe it helps us explain the erasure, the invisibility of the Sephardic experience of the Holocaust, the suffering and the resilience of these Jews at the precipice of Europe, on the edge of civilization, born in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps perceived to be not quite as fully human as others, but murdered nonetheless. Figures like my great uncle Salomon and his wife Esther and their 2 children, murdered at Auschwitz. What I did not know at that time when I was at that Holocaust commemoration as a college student and had that interaction with the survivor who told me that she had never heard of Jews of Greece being in Auschwitz, that same exact year, something else very interesting was going on at Auschwitz. A ceremony was taking place. In the 1960s, plaques in 20 languages of the victims of Auschwitz had been installed to commemorate the distinct cultures and civilizations that had been devastated and impacted by the Holocaust. But there was one language that was missing: Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. And when an Auschwitz survivor himself from Brussels, but as a Turkish citizen, he had been deported to Auschwitz and could not return to Turkey. He survived against all odds. And when he first went back to Auschwitz in the 1990s, he was devastated to see in the display of all the languages of the victims, his culture, his language, his mother tongue not represented. He spent the next nearly a decade lobbying and petitioning with the support of a group of like-minded people for a plaque to be installed in his mother tongue, in Judeo-Spanish. And finally, they succeeded in 2003, 40 years after the other plaques had been erected. And even here, recognition, legitimacy, status as fully human, as worthy of remembrance, could only happen with reference to, through inclusion in Europe. So here's what it says: que este lugar donde los nazis exterminaron 1,5 millones de hombres, de mujeres y de criaturas, la más parte judíos, de varios países de la Europa, sea para siempre, para la humanidad, un grito de desespero y unas señales. May this place, where the Nazis exterminated 1.5 million men, women, and children, the most part Jews, from various countries of Europe, may it be forever, for humanity, a cry of despair and a warning. It reminds me of another encounter that I had with a Holocaust survivor who was asked, "What did you learn from your experience?" She paused and she replied, "Nothing. I learned nothing at all, except how to survive." Thank you for your attention.
All right, welcome back. The live portion of the event. Do share your questions in the Q&A box. Professor Naar, thank you for this wonderful lecture. So I'm going to start with a question from students. A consistent question from students throughout this lecture series has been, why didn't I learn this in high school? I know that high school education is also important to you. What do you think has prevented this chapter from being taught in public schools? And what might be the benefits of incorporating it into a high school curriculum?
I think the answer is embedded in some of the comments that I offered in the talk, which is essentially that our curriculum at all different levels of our educational system is what we might call a Eurocentric or a Western-centric model. And I think that our school curriculum echoes some of these same kinds of hierarchies that I described. And so I think that in order for space to be made for this story that I told about Salonika, or let alone, some of the other geographies that I was talking about, I think we need to have a much broader and more expansive kind of understanding of whose stories matter. And I think whose stories matter are related to whose stories we value. And whose stories we value is related to which people we see as the protagonists of history. And there's a very deeply entrenched kind of sense of, you know, Western and white and Christian and male, all of these kinds of identity categories that we have at play. They reinforce each other, and those are the stories that are going to be more likely to take center stage. And I think we have to jettison, we have to challenge, we have to undo, we have to rewrite. We have to reframe the stories that we tell more generally. This is just one example, I think, of the many domains in which we could benefit from having a recalibration of the kinds of narratives that we tell. And once we did that, then we might be able to find space for the Jews of Salonika or for the Jews of North Africa, or to think about in a kind of a broader comparative context, to bring in the Armenian genocide, to bring in the Herero, to bring in the kind of colonial framework that I tried to introduce today in a very short, I mean, it was a long talk, I guess, but it was still very short in the scheme of things, what I tried to do there.
Definitely. Thank you. So a few people have questions about the new category of European Jews. And I am also really fascinated with your discussion of the creation of this category after the Second World War. There also happened to be a recent article in the New Yorker called Searching for Refuge After the Second World War. Don't know if you saw it. It's about it's very related to this subject matter, what happens after the war with the refugees and how, you know, the Allies, right, they come to the camp, they liberate the refugees, you know, they take some great pictures, they hail themselves as liberators, and then they're completely not interested in giving out visas to Jewish survivors. And they're not interested actually in separating out Jews by nationality yet, right? Until they realize that no European nation wants the Jews. So I'm interested in how kind of that fits with for whom were Jews European now? Like, who are these people who are starting to refer to European Jews, and what are the implications of that? And then I see those other questions from the audience. I promise I will get to you. It's
a really great question. And I think that the category of European Jew is formulated from a couple of different angles. I think on the one hand, like if you go back to early 1960s, Raoul Hilberg's, one of his first really important, one of the first major books about the Holocaust, before the term Holocaust was even used, is called The Destruction of European Jewry. And so this idea of European Jewry actually brings together what had previously been disparate stories. And there is an aspiration. I guess we could say that the category of European Jews is an aspirational category, which seeks to overturn the previous generations of thinking about Jews as really anything other than European. I gave some of the ways in which that framework works. So I think it is an argument that is made by Jewish survivors themselves as a way to try to claim, look, we are part of your story. That story is our story. We are part of the European story. We want to be part of the European story. And then I think it also becomes used by non-Jewish European political figures and writers and scholars to try to understand and come to terms with the atrocities of the war, of the Second World War more generally, and of the Holocaust more specifically, in the framing that I alluded to with this South African figure who was at the United Nations, Smuts, and others like him, that saw this as an internal European disaster, and that really the energies need to be placed on other external enemies that were emergent and new. And so that provides an opportunity for the consolidation of this European category. I mean, Smuts is pretty nefarious in some ways. So he endorses the creation of a state of Israel because he wants to create a European buffer between civilization and uncivilization. And so he sees European Jews as European, but lesser so. And so he wants to create a Jewish state in Palestine as a kind of a blockade against the Muslim world that will be a zone of a zone that will separate, Europe from the rest. Wide away. And so that's why he describes himself as a Zionist and supports Zionism, not because of anything that Jews may have to say about their historic relationship to the land of Israel, but because he sees it as instrumental to European geopolitics and the preservation of civilizational and racial hierarchies.
So to follow up on that, an audience member asked if the Jewish community itself accepts this conception of European Jews.
Well, I think it's a problem that we're dealing with today in our society. I think if European in America especially gets translated as white, we have a problem in the American Jewish community and in American society more generally, which is an assumption of the complete congruence between whiteness and Jewishness. I think in the popular imagination and also in the scholarly literature, Jews are Europeans and white people, and what that's done is it actually has reconfirmed some of the same problems that I was describing with regard to the limits of who's inside the narrative and who's outside. How is it possible to imagine who is Jewish and who is not? That's replicated in the United States. I mean, people speak about Black-Jewish relations, or they speak about Arab-Jewish relations. The problem with both of those categories is that they perceive the components as mutually exclusive. So Black-Jewish relations imagines that all Blacks are not Jewish and that all Jews are not Black, which makes it impossible for somebody to be Black and Jewish, of which there are Black Jews. Same thing with Arab-Jewish dynamics. Problem there is that it imagines Jewish and Arab as mutually exclusive. But of course, many of those Jews, like the ones that I described, coming from North Africa, coming from other parts of the Middle East, who spoke historically Arabic, at one time thought of and were perceived as Arab Jews. And so I think that we have a very strong legacy of this category of the European Jew. And I think that the persistence of it, its staying power, as useful as it was 1 or 2 generations ago, it is now in some ways a liability.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share a question from Professor Sasha Senderovich, who is actually our speaker next week. So he says, thank you for this eye-opening lecture. I'm wondering specifically about Greece in this story, where the lecture began. Jews from Greece, as Professor Naar discusses, would not have been considered as European Jews. And Greece, as he pointed out, is cut off from the maps of the Holocaust in Europe. But how do we square this with something like the centrality of ancient Greece in the Nazi aesthetic, right, culminating most visibly in the delivery of the Olympic torch from Athens to Berlin in 1936?
I would say the first thing is that the Holocaust made Jews in Greece European in a certain way. That is what entered them into the story of Jewish history in modern times. It was the Holocaust that did it. And I think that that's why in Israel, for example, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about gaining recognition for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust or of the expulsions of Jews from Arab lands. It's a very complicated story, but to gain some kind of recognition for it's a very lachrymose kind of narrative, but to get recognition for the Jewish persecution becomes a prerequisite for getting acknowledgement in the Jewish story in modern times. So I would say that it was the Holocaust that in some ways brought European Jews, brought the Jews of Greece into this story of Europe. And I would say that how did the Nazis square the dynamic? So, well, it was discussed in a certain sense. There was actually a petition that was sent from 2 different angles. The first angle is on the question of Greece and ancient Greece as the cradle of civilization. That gave Greek Christians a tiny bit of status. So like they were considered basically Aryan in a way that Slavic speaking populations were not. So that was like their one kind of little elevated piece, although they were perceived as a degenerated kind of race, that they, due to their contact with the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim world and everything like that. So there's one piece. I would say that the civilian population in Greece was also devastated through famine, through pillaging, through very brutal and violent reprisals, burning of villages, So it was a very difficult experience there. I would say the other angle that is made in terms of the Jews from Greece is that there's a very creative petition that is submitted by a Salonican Jew living in Paris to the German embassy, saying that the Jews of Salonika should be exempt from anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic laws in Salonika because racially the Sephardic Jews are not Jewish, they are racially Aryan because they're from Spain and they're really Spanish in terms of their race. And he called them, they are Aryans of the Mosaic persuasion. He got very creative here. He's really desperate trying to get Sephardic Jews exempt from anti-Semitic legislation in Greece. And the German Foreign Office forwards this petition. They're like, wow, maybe it's true. Maybe the Sephardic Jews, maybe they're really not racially Jewish. Maybe they're racial. So they conduct research. They have a team of researchers investigate this question, going into the eugenics literature, into the race science literature, to determine whether or not Sephardic Jews are racially Jewish. Because it's not about belief. It's about, biology and heredity. And they determine that Sephardic Jews are indeed Jewish and they should be subjected to the same anti-Jewish measures. But there are also some of these there's an interesting, we can't get into now, but there's some interesting decisions that the Nazi authorities make with regard to Karaite Jews, which comes out a little bit differently. There are also some other interesting decisions that the Nazis make with regard to the racial status of the Donmei, of the descendants, the Jewish descendants of the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi who converted to Islam in the 17th century, and whether they would be considered racially Jewish. And it just so happens that there was a very prominent Donmei who was genealogically Jewish, outwardly Muslim, but was a very important business person in Berlin, and he stayed the entire time of the war in open sight in Berlin as a very important interlocutor of commercial exchange between Turkey and Germany.
This background is really interesting because of a family story I have about Greek Jews. And I don't know if this is an Israeli story. I'm curious to hear if this is just a unique thing. I heard that when the Greek Jews arrived in Auschwitz, the other Jews thought they were encountering the Maccabees because they were so beautiful. So I wonder, where does this story like that come from?
So that's a really great question. And I think it's related to some of the themes that we've been discussing. There's an exoticism that can have a dual edge to it. So there's you might think it's not an exact analogy, but there's the noble savage kind of element, or there's some, the ancient people that are frozen in time, that they have some redeeming qualities that are often, especially in the Sephardic case, they are cast in terms of looks. Everybody's talking about the way that Sephardic Jews look, because many of them, look like they come from where they come from, which is, they may be a little bit darker complected, but not always. There's a very wide range of complexions and everything that goes along with that. But there was definitely a kind of a mystique about the Jews of Salonika and the Jews of Greece. More generally, you can see it in the memoirs of Elie Wiesel. You can see it in the memoirs of Primo Levi. You can see it in Primo Levi's depiction of the terrible and ferocious Jews of Greece, because one of the other things about the Jews from Salonika, as I alluded to, was that they were, many of them worked at the port or worked with their hands, which was, there were not many menial laborers in other parts of Europe, certainly not port workers. And so there was this perception of the strength of the Greek Jews. And there was some evidence for that. There were a couple of Jewish guys who were boxing champions for the Balkans, and they actually survived Auschwitz boxing for the entertainment of Nazi officials. And this was something that was there were Salonican and Greek Jews were overrepresented in that kind of domain. And I would say the flip side of that also comes out we talked about refugees earlier. And one of the saddest stories that I've come across in my research, a really devastating account, is in the displaced persons camp in Feldafing, which is outside of Munich, and it was an American controlled DP camp, and there were several thousand Jews there, and mostly Jews from Poland, some from Hungary, and some from Greece. And what winds up happening is that there is a business altercation between a Polish Jew and a Salonican Jew, and it gets physical. and the Polish Jew calls the Salonican Jew dirty and cheap, which is interesting because those are just regular anti-Semitic accusations now that a Polish Jew has internalized, now is projecting onto this Greek Jew, and it winds up in essentially a group of Greek Jews beat up this Polish Jew, and a rumor circulates through the DP camp that the Polish Jew has been killed, and a group of Polish Jews come together and they burn down the encampments of the Greek Jews, perpetrating a pogrom, essentially, and that's what the Salonican Jews speak about. So that's like the flip side of like the difference. What do you do with this difference? Everybody acknowledges that there's difference, and people place different valences and meaning to it, and they can be activated and co-opted into very different dramas. So the drama of Jewish national revival, they're the Maccabees in person, or they are the residue of they are not part of Europe. They are not part of civilization. They're dirty and they're cheap, and they deserve to be punished for their iniquities.
Answer. Okay, I'm going to combine two questions from the audience, from Alex and from Dr. Sarah Zaitis. So, does some of the exclusions of non-European stories, i.e. North Africa, as you mentioned, have more to do with the lack of access to sources, lack of access to the region, rather than an intentional exclusion in the scholarship? My understanding is that the Holocaust in Europe has been easier to study because of the meticulous documentation on the part of the Nazi state.
It's a really excellent question, and I do not think that they can be completely disentangled from each other. In other words, access to resources, access to languages, and this sort of intentional or unintentional, but broader kind of, I think it's not necessarily intentional, it's just this is how it is, the way in which we understand kind of hierarchies of value and importance. So when I began my research about the Jews from Salonika, for example, there were no books on the subject in English about the history of the Jews of Salonika or of Greece. Not a single book in English. Now there are several. And nobody had looked at the archives. Nobody even tried to look at the archives. And so the explanation was twofold. First, the archives had been destroyed. And second of all, if I could find the archives, I wouldn't be able to read them. And so now you have to think about what languages get prioritized in terms of being valued languages for study. Like there's a value that's placed on it. There are, let's say, limited resources, and there's a limited number of hours in the day, and you cannot learn, all the 30 languages you might need to know to be able to do investigations about all the different kinds of communities involved. But I think it's very telling that, there are no universities in the United States where you can learn Ladino on a regular basis, or Judeo-Arabic. They're just, fits in some different kinds of places. I think that has to do with the value and the status that is associated with the language, and thus with the speech community of that language, with their story and with their history. I mean, this goes for many different communities and populations across the world. And so I think that there is a countervailing element. So it's like, on the one hand, access. So like when I went to go and look for the archives, I eventually was able to find the records of the Jewish community of Salonika. I had to go to Moscow, and I had to go to Jerusalem, and I had to go to Athens, and I had to go to New York, and I had to go to Washington, D.C., but I was able to find them. Nobody even thought to look. That's the other thing. Why not think to look?
Need more people in the field, right? Okay, I'm going to read this question from David Ratzier. At the Oregon Holocaust Memorial in Portland, where I volunteer, a conscious choice was made for the memorial to reflect, as has been said, the variety of stories of those impacted by the Holocaust. What are some things we can and should do at this point to stop the marginalization you addressed in your lecture?
I think it's an excellent question, and I guess mine was not so. I didn't have such a optimistic kind of response here, but I'm very happy for this question, because I think it is essential, and I do believe that things can be done to alter, at least in the framework of Holocaust memory, the way in which the story is told. And I do not think it is a zero-sum game. So I think that sometimes we'll say, well, this goes for all curricular discussions. Well, we only have, again, X number of classes or X number of sessions. If we want to include something else, what are we going to have to sacrifice? And I don't think that's a useful way to think about it, although decisions will in the end have to be made. But I think that what you could do is to scope out. All right, well, here are the different qualitatively distinct kinds of narratives or stories or experiences that you want to have represented, and think about the different threads that you might be able to bring forward to begin to express those stories, having some representative elements. So you're not going to be able to tell the story of all the different communities that existed. Like, as I mentioned, there were over 20 Jewish communities in Greece. I told you about one. So in my own process of trying to provide space for a community's experience that hasn't been widely incorporated into the general narrative, I also excluded other ones. So like, choice will not go away. Exclusions and the process of inclusion and exclusion will not go away. But I do think that some strategic choices can be made if you take a step back and you say, okay, well, here are these different kinds of distinct cultural groups or geographic groups or linguistic groups or political groups, however you want to frame those kinds of narratives, and think about how they could be integrated into a whole. And again, I spoke about Jews in this context with reference to others. I didn't speak about the other half a dozen, at least, groups that were targeted by the Nazis, not necessarily with the final solution in the same way, but certainly targets of mass violence by the Nazi regime. And so I think that finding a way to incorporate a diversity of perspectives becomes very, 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 very integral.
I agree. Okay, last question from Ilana Hoffenberg. Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I would be interested to hear more about the way the Holocaust memory shapes contemporary European identity, and specifically the European Union. How does the fight to devote attention to the experience of Jews in these eras during the Holocaust connect to contemporary contests over the boundaries of Europe?
Well, since 2005, there has been a EU-sanctioned and also UN-sanctioned International Holocaust Commemorations Day in January for the liberation of Auschwitz. And this becomes part and parcel of the expectations about what EU member nations are supposed to do. They are supposed to participate in some kind of Holocaust commemoration, and that is now part of what it actually means to be European, is to acknowledge the Holocaust. I think it's sort of the tail end of what I said. The making of the European Jews also in some ways made Europe, in a certain sense, and the commemoration now 80 years later is also about staking a claim on who is inside of Europe and who is outside of Europe in that regard. And so how does it play out in the contest over who is inside of Europe and who is outside of Europe? It's a very, very important question. And you can see these kinds of issues debated in parts of Eastern Europe, in the Balkans and other places, in which Holocaust commemoration, in many countries, by the way, is under the aegis of the foreign ministry, because it is about representing a country to Europe and the world. So it is part of international politics. It is part of international diplomacy.
I guess that in part sort of explains why the U.S. Holocaust Museum is also on the National Mall.
Well, right. There are probably other reasons for that as well, because I think the one thing that's that's a whole nother discussion, but I think that one piece of that would very much separate the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. from these other places is, number one, the Holocaust did not happen in the United States. It is distanced from the topography of terror, but it doesn't mean that, as you already alluded to, the United States was also not involved in some ways, both in the ways that you mentioned, like in my own family's case, rejecting visa applications before the war, preventing refugees from coming to the country, or also, as now has become clear, and there's been some scholarship in the field in recent years, but if you've read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, where she speaks about the ways in which American conceptions of race and American conceptions of segregation and anti-miscegenation laws were inspiration for Hitler's Germany. I mean, in Mein Kampf, the only country that Hitler praises for having essentially a white supremacist society that he would like to see develop in Germany is the United States. So the United States is implicated and involved in many different ways. The difference here is that it's not in Europe, but it is part of the West.
Right.
It is part of the West.